So I'm Raymond. I'm a co-founder of Commonwealth Labs, and I'm here to talk about Edgeware. What is Edgeware? Ryan has already given us a little bit of an introduction. Edgeware is the first smart contract chain on Polkadot. But I think probably more interesting now that we're all here to talk about it, kind of like about some of the really specific features and what we're doing with it. Edgeware is a Webassembly chain that makes use of all of the latest technology in parity substrate. So it's going to be this super fast proof of stake network with an open token distribution. So we're doing this thing called a lock drop where we give out most of the tokens to community members who hold ETH. And the network will be owned, governed by the community, and we will be building a set of interfaces and systems that help people incentivize everybody who participates in the network. Whether you're a dApp developer, core developer, a validator, or a different kind of constituent. But I think probably makes sense to kind of start with the base. So WebAssembly smart contracts, everybody's heard about them. There are a number of networks, Enigma being one of them, but other networks like Dfinity as well that have been talking about how. So WebAssembly smart contracts. Everybody is, I think, super excited about this technology, both within the blockchain world and outside. Now it's become possible to run WebAssembly inside your browser to compile applications from a number of different platforms to it. This is kind of the tech that everybody has been waiting 10 years for, the ability to run anything you want in your browser. So hopefully we'll make two jumps at once. One is the ability to compile from any platform, Rust or otherwise, to this language, but then also be able to run this on a blockchain. And potentially be able to run it in a way that is super lightweight, super permissionless, and you can deploy the code from anywhere to Edgeware or another network, and be able to have it run with the assurance and security of the Edgeware network and other networks that Edgeware is tied to. The kind of general strategy we're taking is Edgeware is going to build off of what's available on Parity Substrate, and Parity Substrate gives us all of the basic core components that are used to support the WebAssembly blockchain. What we're building is primarily a set of governance systems and identity systems that plug in, that allow people to deploy these contracts and then interface with things like a verified set of identities. We're going to deploy that in Edgeware first, so we'll open up a system that lets people link social identities. Initially, that will give you the ability to show who you are as you participate in Edgeware governance. You'll be able to make a profile. Over a longer period of time, I think people will build more interesting things on there. So there will be DAOs, there will be systems for making groups, anonymous voting, etc. And all of that will become available on Edgeware, and otherwise it'll all be open source. The larger vision is Edgeware is a network where the governance pieces and the smart contract pieces will sit next to each other. So you will have the ability to vote on upgrades at the beginning. I think that'll be the first interesting use of the blockchain is you've got a large number of stakeholders that are distributed around the world that have massively different opinions, but also massively different skills and abilities. Can they construct a system of incentives that lets people continue improving the chain? So what is that going to look like? We're building the first version of Edgeware Identity, and that's going to be fairly straightforward. You create a post on Twitter or Facebook, LinkedIn, etc. Probably not LinkedIn, and everybody who's validating the network can see that post. The first version, Commonwealth, is the only validator, and we're going to launch where Commonwealth is operating a set of centralized oracles, and we say this set of identity is verified, it looks valid. Over time, that'll operate itself, and so we'll probably move that to a set of validators that is a subset of the overall validator set of Edgeware. They will use tooling like the off-chain contract computation capability, which Gav has talked about and is part of Parity Substrate. And that means that we'll write the identity module as a blob of WASM. Validators around the world will download that, and then everybody will have the code that says, hey, if someone posts an identity to the network, I want to scrape that, validate it, and if it's correct, I'm going to say that it's correct. The network will come to consensus, and for the first time, we'll have a decentralized, instant verifying identity system. If you want to make a post saying, I revoke my identity, we'll make it possible to do that. You submit something to the chain validates that this has happened around the world, and all of that gets written to the state of the system. This is kind of like one side of things. The other side is just the whole WebAssembly toolchain, which has just started to be developed. As of about a week ago, it became possible to go on the Parity substrate documentation, and you can go find a link to Ink, which is the substrate contract language. So it's actually possible to go write a basic smart contract in Rust and deploy it to testnet. We haven't done this yet. We're going to do this over the next 2 weeks or so, and so there will be the first WASM smart contracts live on Edgeware on a testnet at that point. Another kind of angle on this, and this is coming at it from a totally different side, is the Edgeware token distribution. I think that this is something that is pretty key towards getting the set of people that we want on board. The Edgeware lock drop, which we revealed back in August of last year, is imminent. It's starting 2 weeks away. We've published the contracts. We've gotten them audited. We're doing the final checks on the user interface that we're providing to people. We're giving away 90% of Edge to the community. This is 2019. I think if you're building an openly governed chain, you want to figure out some way you can do that so you can engage as many people as possible and help them kind of participate in the upside. Handshake pioneered like one very good model, which is they have this signed Merkle tree of hashes of people who have been active GitHub users and have followers on GitHub. We're doing a somewhat different model, I think, because we're super interested in onboarding people who already have a stake in the blockchain ecosystem. It's possible that we'll distribute more Edge later to other people. But what we're doing first is this token generation event called a lock drop. You time lock ETH, and depending on the amount of essentially opportunity cost that you've given up by time locking your ETH, you get a different amount of Edge. All of that gets pooled, so it's all pro rata. And in the end, there's a max which is set fairly high for how much ETH gets locked up. But the idea is a fairly large portion of Ethereum holders can participate in this network, which will be much more progressive and operate fairly differently from how Ethereum operates. The specific economics of the lock drop, there's basically 4 options. If you are super long-term hodler of ETH, you can lock up ETH for 12 months. That'll get you a 2.2x weight, so essentially 120% bonus, which is a fairly large bonus, but essentially we're counting opportunity cost here. So right, if you lock up for twice as long, you've given up effectively twice the amount of exposure to Ethereum, and so you should get commensurately more. You can lock up for 3 months or 6 months, or you can do this thing, which is signaling, where you essentially don't actually lock up any Ether, but you sign a contract, or you sign a message, or provide your address, and then submit that to your lock drop contract. We see that you are the owner of a certain amount of Ethereum, and we allocate you Edge as a result. The thinking around this is, this is kind of similar but different from a fork or a hard spoon, in that we want as many people to be able to participate as possible. But instead of just giving out ETH or Edge to everybody who holds ETH, and effectively having a very large amount of that end up in going to exchanges, going to passive token holders, and people who might not be very active on this network or really don't have a stake in it, we want to give Edge to people who do want to have a stake in it. So the signaling option, you get 0.2x what you would have gotten from the 3-month locking option, and then you get some portion of that up front and some portion of that mid-year. So who do we want to participate in the lock drop? I think it's a pretty wide set of people, and there are a bunch of ways that you can actually participate because of the way the contracts have been built. Definitely people who are kind of core developers and super invested in the ecosystem, if you've been in Ethereum for a long time. But also people who are stakers, validators, people who have existing ETH treasuries, projects. We've already passed one Aragon governance proposal that allows the Aragon association to decide whether or not they want to participate in the lock drop by locking up for 3 months. Otherwise, I think if you're an individual or you have holdings in other assets, you can do things like go to Compound and borrow a certain amount of ETH and signal that. And if you do that on the day of the lock drop is going to have its snapshot taken at the very end of the lock drop. So I think it'll be pretty interesting to see how the mechanics of that unfold, because there is a fairly large amount of ETH available on there, and people have some interesting opportunities for things they can do with that. Otherwise, I mean, I kind of want to get to the governance part of this. What are we going to do with the community governance aspect of the whole network? There's essentially 3 levels of governance that we're kind of making available. The core kind of emulates Polkadot, and that's a democracy and council system, which is fairly similar to Polkadot's governance system. It is time-locked voting with a council of, I think at the beginning it'll be 11. That number will get adjusted of major holders of Edge. The holders will presumably signal their identities, and so you'll be able to see who those holders are. But in effect, if we get a meaningful amount of participation in voting, really it is still token holder governance. It's everyone who was in the lock drop and what they think are the right upgrades to make. Outside of that, there is a signaling module where we basically created that in order to create more organic participation in the network, where you lock up a very small amount of Edge and you can make a proposal that is zero-stake signaling. And that can be used to do things like gather sentiment around something that you are interested in building, or it can be used to gather the network sentiment around a major network change or 2 different directions or 2 different philosophies. And all of that is non-binding, so I think people will learn how to use that as time goes on. To kind of make that process possible, we've created an interface. So this is kind of the Commonwealth interface. These are mock-ups of kind of like things that people would be voting on. Here's the actual interface right now. You can actually go on this and it's already live, and we'll be refining it over the next 2-3 months before the network goes live. This is going to make it super easy to do anything from just announce who you are and say that, I'm participating in this network, who else is here, and how do I figure out what you're interested in, to things like create a proposal around something that you want to build, so let's input on it. Over time, I think we'll do things like make it possible to incentivize all stages of the development process. So if you are designing something and you think it's an interesting idea, you can perhaps claim a small amount of Edge for having just gotten started on the work. And then over time, as you get more invested in the project and you really start to work for the chain, then we can basically figure out a way to lock up a certain amount of Edge from this Treasury DAO and make it available to you as the milestones kind of get hit. And this will be pretty interesting because I think it'll be one of the first cases in the world where you can have people that are working for a DAO or working for a network. And there are a huge number of people I've met out there who are super interested in this technology and have just not found the right centralized team to work on. And it'll be really cool to see how we manage to motivate and bring them on board to this. So kind of like last bits of this, the block reward is 50% of the block reward is going to go into this centralized DAO. It'll be used to incentivize a number of different activities, among them core protocol development, major improvements to substrate, major improvements to Edgeware, as well as development on the network. This is also a WebAssembly chain, so naturally we'll be looking out for interesting applications of WASM smart contracts. Otherwise, there are all of the points that I kind of mentioned earlier: quorum lock duration voting, the quorum biasing piece, identity. And kind of like to wrap this all up, so Edgeware is going to launch initially as an independent chain. We want to kind of figure out how these mechanisms work without trying to run it and launch it at the same time as Polkadot. Polkadot does support a feature where you can seamlessly migrate from one form of consensus to another. This is being built out and should be live by September or December or so of this year. So the intention is for Edgeware holders to vote around that change, and supposing that everything goes as expected, which we think will happen since most people who are locking up in Edgeware have pretty much aligned with this general roadmap, Edgeware will become part of the Polkadot network. For the first year or two, I think that will become, Edgeware will be one of the first chains in the network, and there won't be meaningful costs. Over time, the Edge token, which is used to govern the network, govern the set of smart contracts that are on Edgeware, and then eventually pay for smart contract fees once those are, once there is enough volume, that will be used, and we'll do the standard kind of decentralized exchange model, and so the Edge network will pay the dot network as one of the kind of like key on-ramps. So why participate in this, and why use Edgeware? Why do we think people will use Edgeware? First of all, definitely as a means to deploy onto Polkadot and to gain all the benefits of Polkadot interconnectivity. You can just write a smart contract. You don't have to build a whole network in a chain and come up with your own economics and figure out a way to bid on the auction for a parachain slot or buy a parachain slot on Polkadot. The other side of things, the tech here being built here is somewhat unique. There's a fairly small number of governance-oriented chains right now. Most chains want to be token holder and stakeholder governed in the long term, but there's a lot of unique tech there around identities, around voting. And so being able to build things around identity sets, for example, or anonymous voting. We're about 50% of the way done through a snark-based anonymous voting implementation. That'll be one of the things that goes live on Edgeware fairly shortly after launch. And then generally being part of the Polkadot ecosystem. So you can connect to any chain that is bridged to Polkadot. Longer term, Edgeware is going to be this governance-focused chain, so it is up to the token holders and stakeholders, all the people who locked up at ETH in order to get on the Edgeware network, to do a really great job of governing it. We are, as Commonwealth Labs, going to participate in the governance of the chain, but it is really decentralized what happens. Every distribution of Edge, every council vote or treasury vote is going to be done by a set of other Edge holders, and we expect to be minority voters in all of those examples. So this really is a system to see how do the emergent kind of community norms come about around this network. In the worst case, people will vote no, and the chain will mostly stay as it is. So there is a certain amount of kind of like protection inbuilt to the system. It is fairly easy for people to vote no. But otherwise, I think it'll be really interesting to see what kind of incentives people come up with to improve the system and get the system to improve itself. I think this is the kind of network where it'll come out of the gate without an ICO, without a token sale. People will initially be thinking about and spending a lot of time thinking about, like, how do you price this? What's the right value? Over time, we expect that even over the first 6 months after we launch, it'll be the time where people start deploying and coming up with ideas. We'd like to see it become the case that even when someone thinks of a really good idea and puts it on the network and gets support, that should be something that starts to move, move the general sentiment around the chain. Because when you have this kind of like on-chain active governance system, you can see a project go from no funding, no team, to here's an idea, here are people being commissioned and paid to work on the idea, to code being deployed to the network in a potentially much, much faster way. In the super long run, I think Edgeware and this Edge token, and what it really becomes is a share of governance and voting power over this autonomous jurisdiction. And this is one jurisdiction inside the Polkadot network that has connectivity to a lot of other areas. Initially, you'll see what kind of smart contracts people come up with and identity systems people come up with. Over time, I'm sure, as with all applications of technology, certain applications get used more than others, certain ones become more subject to power laws than others. The idea is, if we do really, really well, Edgeware will come up with something that is an incentive for large numbers of people kind of in the outside world, outside the blockchain world, to participate. Whether this is something relating to voting, polling, signaling, distribution of funds, maybe you lock up DAI, put it on Polkadot, custody it on Edgeware, and use anonymous voting and an Edgeware-based DAO to distribute that. Or it could be something totally different. It could be a bridge to Twitter or a bridge to Reddit. There's some super interesting governance experiments being run around Reddit Karma and Reddit Donuts. All of these things are things that could someday live on Edgeware and ultimately become part of the operating of this jurisdiction. And all those things are things that could be really huge and make up the larger promise of essentially Polkadot and Web3. And so Edgeware kind of being the first WebAssembly and smart contract network for this is this opportunity for people to kind of like come in and be part of their beginning. So kind of to wrap this all up, we're going to launch the lock drop contract officially on June 1st. We'll probably show people a bunch of the pieces behind that before the contract launches and the lock drop is open. But if you are an ETH holder, if you're interested in being an ETH holder or being an Edge holder, lots of ways to get involved. If you're interested in kind of like learning more about what you can deploy onto the network, also definitely find your way to our website. Follow us on Twitter. There's also a Discord where we're doing kind of like everybody is all the developers are there day to day and will answer questions like how do you become a validator. The Commonwealth forum has currently a small handful of posts and is kind of just getting bootstrapped and started. But if you go there and sign up for emails, you can introduce yourself and say hi. And over the next 3 months, while the lock drop is running and in the months leading up to network launch, there'll be a lot more content there, and we'll be looking forward to sharing all that we have coming up with you guys. That's all I got. Any questions?
Say like we're a network where we've already distributed our solutions and there are nodes running our software and buying the service, but we have no governance. We have no way of changing the inflation rate by without foundation itself making that decision. I understand like how you can help with interface and voting and some security deposits attached to that. Do you walk me through how that would actually provide some guarantees to the nodes that what they vote for will get implemented?
Are you referring to a network on an Edgeware, outside Edgeware?
That's what I'm asking. Like how would you integrate Edgeware such that would be easy?
I can think of a couple of ideas. One is Edgeware or Polkadot bridges to the network, and then we give you the ability to do things like anonymous signaling. So if you hold an address on the other network, you can sign a message and post it. We verify that you're properly a holder, and that can allow the foundation to collect signal around what you think is valid. That could potentially be very powerful if you combine it with another mechanism, like incentivizing people to participate in signaling. Otherwise, I think it is a possibility that Polkadot has been described as a network of relay chains. So it's possible that someday Edgeware could become a relay chain in itself and be used as its own meta jurisdiction where other networks kind of connect to Edgeware for security, and then Edgeware is being validated by Polkadot for security. I think those are a couple.
From the beginning, it's a lot easier if you started building from scratch.
It's a lot easier if you built from scratch, and if you're using Substrate, you can compile your chain into WebAssembly.